Well, tonight we're just one step short of the actual death of Jesus, and I thank you. I thank the participants here for following this journey that we've been on, and we've done it in some detail. The gospel journey of Mark that Mark gives us, and we've seen it in a kind of stark and even harsh way. Uh, Everything is just stripped down to the actual bones or skeletal structure of the gospel. It doesn't have so many of the teachings like the Sermon on the Mount. And so we are just led through this incredibly impactful career of Jesus. And when you get to his entry to Jerusalem in chapter 11, you kind of like in the latter third, even more than that, of the gospel, but that takes up the whole of the drama, or sorry, it consists of the drama of Jesus' final days in Jerusalem, what we know as the Passion. And you could say that everything else is a preparation for that. And when you, or sorry, if you see the death of Jesus in terms of some kind of compensatory offering to God to reconcile God to us because God has been offended, then the harshness of the narrative becomes offensive. If this is all in service of an overarching violence on the part of God, and we see the violence played out at the human level and then think, well, it's because this has been deemed necessary by God in heaven for God's own self-satisfaction in whatever way, then the violence becomes, in a way, doubly difficult. And I think doing this material now, this evening, today, and in the previous weeks, it becomes more and more clear to me why we have this history in Christianity of anti-Semitism, what is called anti-Semitism. I don't know whether that's a good word anymore, the way it's bandied around so much and used as a, very glib accusation to any kind of opponent of American policies in Palestine. But whatever, I mean, we know that Christianity, both East and West, has got this horrendous history of persecution of the Jews. And I think it's not by accident, because, and this has been driving my, or has appeared in my thinking or my understanding as we dealt with this material, because this material, in the material that we're looking at, the violence is so graphic, not in terms of like the Passion of the Christ, which is what Mel Gibson did, to kind of in some ways both kind of demystify the violence to make it real in historical terms, but also, I suppose, in some ways to underline the kind of atonement theory maybe he was working on. Whatever, it's all part of the history of the violence of the Passion. That's kind of latest installment of it. But if all this violence that we're looking at in terms of its mechanics, and that's really what the Gospels shows us is not so much its physical impact on a body, the body of Jesus, but the mechanics, the way it plays out in terms of human relations. And that impacts us, and that has always been the impact of the Holy Week liturgy. I think, speaking from a Catholic perspective, when I was a kid and went to the Holy Week liturgies, it was just this kind of like, and earlier on, Sheila was talking about Mozart's Requiem and that kind of thing, that there's this sense of doom in the Passion that is inescapable, and we don't like to face it. But the Christian practice has been to face it, at least in the, you read the scriptures, that's the Protestant tradition, and then you rehearse the liturgy, which is the Catholic tradition. And so we've kind of been forced to face this this horror. And because it has been in service of an overarching violence on the part of God, it has not deconstructed violence itself, but in some ways reinforced the thematic of violence in the listener, in the reader, the uneducated reader, or should we say the one who has not been converted in any way, but just is forced to listen to it. The reaction is, as is always the case, when we are impacted by violence, according to mimetic theory, is that we have to find someone to blame. It's the way of dealing with it. We have to say, if we're impacted neurologically, relationally, by violence, then we have to, our mind, it's more than the mind, it's your whole self. It starts scanning the world, scanning your environment to find someone to blame. And as we read Mark tonight, and especially the passage to do with Pilate and the role of the crowd in relation to Pilate, it would be very automatic for the kind of crowd of Christians listening to this, being in some ways forced to hear it, to begin to look for a scapegoat, because the violence is intact, because it's there, it's preserved, and even embedded and reinforced because it comes from God. God is requiring this. So there's no deconstruction of violence itself. It's actually hardened up at the metaphysical, theological level. And so that the function of the violence, as it impacts the audience, is to make them look for a scapegoat. So it's almost as if, and we can see this in the history, that the history of actual anti-Semitism in the West really takes off in the 12th century. That's when the myths of what they call the blood libel and poisoning of wells, all that kind of stuff, that's when you start to hear about it and read about it, and it results in riots and persecutions in places like York in England, and of course, across the whole of the Western world. So all that postdates, that comes after Anselm's theory of the necessity of the Passion in order to satisfy the offended honor and justice of God. That's at the end of the 11th century. So there's a kind of a telltale evidence in the rise of communal anti-Semitism from the 12th and 13th century onwards. Why it wasn't there? There was a kind of hostility there before, but it's more theological, and it's more kind of like the Roman Empire had it organized, but not that bitter kind of direct persecution, wanting to burn people's houses, kill people, ravage territory, wipe people out, that you got actually in the First Crusade, that's all post-Anselm. So it's something now, if you turn to these scriptures with a very different interpretative lens, and you see them not in the service of a higher violence, not actually a record of the employment of violence by this kind of divine atonement mechanism, but instead the revelation of violence, its disclosure, in order that we might learn how to give it up through Christ, then of course that whole history, I would argue anyway, is undone. At least it's undone in those who are seeing it in this new way. But of course, that is yet to percolate at all into collective understanding and consciousness, that people will understand actually the gospel says something very, very different from blaming the Jews. But the fact is, go ahead, Ruben. You have to turn on. Turn on.
I said, when you finish, if this part before you go into what you're going to go next, I wanted to make a comment of what I just read recently and some observations reflections that I was making. I'm reading a second biography of Felipe II, from the monarch of Spain. And it's interesting. I'm reading the part again where when he marries Mary, Queen of England. And it was Mary, or it was before that, her predecessor, who in 1250 something, 1256, I think, who signed the proclamation or made the proclamation to expel the Jews from England. And
Whoa.
it was a 12 something. And in fact, she gave the rabbis or the synagogue to her seamstress after they were expelled and moved out and all that. But I was thinking what you said earlier right now about the crowd, the phenomena, what Gerard reveals, the phenomena of the crowd in the Gospels. And I thought about ice. Now, I am brown. I am very brown. And of course, ice affects me directly in the United States because I am a target. And I was thinking, oh, ICE, they covered their faces with masks. And I thought, what does the anonymity play in Girardian terms with the crowd? Because the crowd, there is an anonymity of the crowd as a vehicle of violence because they don't want to be identified as a you, as a other, as a person. It's, and I was just thinking about that, and I just kept turning over that idea of the crowd being an anonymous amoeba, a glob of a force for kind of like an instrument of evil or of violence. But anyway, so now that you're getting into that, I thought I just wanted to share that I did see the part. I mean, I did just read. I forgot who it was, but it was a predecessor of Mary or Mary herself, Queen Mary the First, who um, was, bringing back the Catholic institutions and the reconciliation with Rome. And I think my point right now was to.
Well, you're talking about Mary, who succeeded Queen Elizabeth I. It was a short reign.
Before Elizabeth.
It's Mary, Queen of Scots, I think.
Mary, Queen of Scots.
Mary, Queen of Scots, but
No, he's not. He's talking about Elizabeth's older sister,
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Henry VIII's oldest child, who
Yeah.
became the
Catherine's
queen after
daughter.
Edward died.
And the original Mary, of course, was a Habsburg. She
Right.
came from Spain.
But
Correct.
anyhow, what you're saying is that what you're saying is trying to restore the Catholic faith in England.
Yes. So no.
After,
Yes, so what I'm saying is, yes, they were anti-Semitic. They were getting rid of the Jews way back then in England, before 1492, way before Spain did officially.
right. So this goes,
It's
okay,
yeah,
right.
so it's earlier, much
Yeah.
earlier. And the anecdote that I wanted to share that was in this biography that I've read, again, a second one, where Queen Mary gave the synagogue to her seamstress.
Right.
After they expelled, the Jews, but it was just like the idea of anyway, the phenomena of the crowd. I just wanted to
Right. Yes. Well, thank
that it's a
thank you.
recent thing.
And
Even
remarking
now
on your
with
own
ICE. Yeah,
your own personal stake in this.
I mean,
It's quite
I'm giggling, but I shouldn't be giggling because
no, it's not. It's not
serious.
funny. Should you be
It's
arrested or?
ridiculously serious.
Yes, that's right. So anyway, I mean, with all that context, both contemporary with ICE and with anybody with brown skin or whatever, and they're going back in history to targeting the Jews because they seem to be indicated by the gospel itself. What we're looking at is the way, Rubens' remarks refer to it, is the way the Girardian understanding brings all this to the surface, and it makes the account of the Passion that much more harder, harsher, more vivid, more radical, and yet more transformative. That's the point. That if it's just a declaration of violence or an exhibition of violence, it's going to harden up violence unless you get to that level where you say, actually, what God is doing is revealing the character of violence itself through Jesus, and Jesus is doing it as the servant of God in order for us to let go of it. And I'm sure many, many Christians came to that, but I'm talking about the big kind of territorial reality of Christianity where you had thousands and thousands of people going to church and never really properly catechized in any way, not by the monasteries, not at all. I mean, the monasteries were small affairs compared to the thousands and thousands of people. So there's going to be this natural effluent, shall we say, this phenomenon of looking for someone to blame. But anyway, that's all by way of preface for what we're going to read tonight. No, but it's very important. It's hugely important. And you may laugh, Linda. I know you're my wife. You're entitled to laugh at me. But okay, it's hugely important. And the reason why is because we're at this kind of pivot point. I think we're at this kind of turning point, actually, in human history, enormously, because of what's rising out of the text so cleanly today. So, let's get to it. So let's read chapter 15, verses. We just read the whole chunk together, verses 1 to 20, and then we'll dig into it, and you can see what's going on here. One thing to notice, first of all, there's two things to notice: is the role of the crowd. It's exactly what Ruben is talking about, and what I'm referencing, and then the role of Pilate in relation to the crowd. Those two things that we start off by noting those things. So if we're going to read chapter 15, verses 1 to 20. Go ahead, Mac.
As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him.
Thank you very much. We just read the account of the trial of Jesus before Pilate, and it segues directly then into the actual crucifixion. And we're trying to see the mechanics of this, how this actually works in terms of the functional relationships that are going on, and the relationships that function in and through violence, or as violence. So the first thing is, how does I asked people to look out for the role of Pilate now, in relation to the crowd. How does Pilate come across in this narrative here? And we remember Jesus has just been literally, the actual word, handed over by the chief priests to Pilate, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But how does Pilate come across here in this narrative?
Kind of reasonable, actually. Kind of like he's trying to find ways to let Jesus off somehow.
Right. Now, what we know from history that Pilate is not a very pleasant character. I mean, he's generally regarded as highly provocative governor in Jerusalem, who didn't care for the sensibilities of the Jews at all, and eventually was recalled by Rome and then disappears from history. To be recalled by Rome, you'd have to be pretty bad. In other words, you were more trouble than you're worth. So Pilate wasn't a successful colonial administrator, and his temperament didn't seem suited for the job, if anybody could be suited for it. But so if you say here, Linda, that, and I think it's correct, that he seems reasonable, the commentators have said, well, in that case, the writer of the gospel is painting Pilate in as acceptable and as reasonable tones as possible, Because of what? Why would they say that? Why would possibly, as an explanation of why Pilate is presented as reasonable, what would that be?
Well, this gospel is for the Roman world.
Right, right. So that has been a standard response, that Pilate is let off very lightly in the Gospels, rather than being a brutal, contempt-filled colonial administrator, because this is an apologetics, basically, to the Roman powers, to Roman culture and Roman institutions generally, which of course Christianity had to live with for another 300 years at least before the conversion of Christianity, the conversion of Rome. So that's an explanation.
He's also a foil.
Go ahead, Matt,
He's a
go ahead.
foil to the more bloodthirsty crowd.
Right.
And so he has to yield to the crowd. He cannot go against it.
Right. So if you see it from that perspective, that he's a foil for the crowd, or is a possible function of the crowd, or as a colonial administrator, he's there to control the crowd in the circumstances of the Passover, when you have perhaps 1 million people in the city, as is calculated by some. It's a very, very large crowd in a small city. His job is to keep order. So that's a very plausible political explanation. That it sees the thing from the other perspective, that the crowd then becomes the major agent here, and Pilate is trying, but still he is trying to be he's trying to be reasonable, as Linda says, which ultimately he is not. I mean, he accepts or not just, should we say, maybe he is being rational. He said, okay, the crowd needs to have its a pound of blood, its pound of flesh, and he hands Jesus over to be crucified, after having him gratuitously flogged as well, which wasn't always the case for someone who's going to be crucified. He just
on the Zoom meeting, not in your back.
Sorry.
That's all right, Tom.
So he basically he joins in the persecution, sure, but that's kind of jumping ahead a little bit. So we have these two perspectives. On the one hand, the crowd has to be controlled. On the other hand, Pilate is painted too reasonably. And what is if you're looking at the thing on the surface, what is the result of that? Pilate's the reasonable guy. The crowd is the force of evil. How then you got to respond? First of all, Reuben, and then Cheryl.
I was just gonna say that he does appear initially to be fair and just, but then he does acquiesce to the unjust and unfair demands of the crowd.
Right. Cheryl, thank you.
So also, the scapegoating mechanism depends quite a bit on the unanimity of the crowd. And Pilate is operating outside of that, and he is not a unanimous voice in this text. He clearly states that he doesn't find any reason.
That's right.
So he is not part of the unanimous voice. He does acquiesce to the authority of the crowd. In this text, the crowd is the authority and not Pilate.
Right.
But Pilate is a voice there that is not unanimous with the crowd.
Right. He says clearly, what evil has he done?
Right.
Pilate has not been convinced, but on any level, that this guy is a criminal.
So it's a little interruption there in all of this unanimous crucify him, whatever.
right.
This it's a little interruption. Sometimes that's all we can be too. Not that I would want to be Pilate, but sometimes we can only be a little interruption in a
Right.
force that is overwhelming.
And as Ruben says, ultimately he does acquiesce. I mean, he stands his ground for a bit in the account, but then he acquiesces and he said he has him flogged. Not only does he say, okay, you can crucify him, but I'll add my pound of, or my element of torture to this guy. So he joins in the
He
persecution.
does.
Sheila, go ahead.
You have the impression that he finds the whole thing an enormous nuisance and he wants it to go away.
Right, yeah, I think that's very plausibly true. And that he has no idea of really why this guy's been handed over to him. He probably has no respect for the chief priest. And well, we know historically that he doesn't have respect for other things he did. He has contempt for the temple and for the whole apparatus of the temple. So he would not agree automatically with the chief priests, and he might even want to block what they wanted, at least to offer some kind of resistance. So there's a whole kind of range of possible responses in him, either annoyance or wanting in some ways to interfere, to frustrate the high priests, whatever. But we know that in the meantime, as Mac is saying, and others are saying, you've got this huge pressure. I mean, you've got the institution of Pilate. Whatever he is as a character, he is an institution. He represents the might of Rome, and he does have the soldiers at his disposal, and he could set them loose on the crowd. Of course, that would be a massacre, and he would be reported for it, and he might lose his job for it. So he has to balance those things. But we have him as an institution, and then you have the pressure of this crowd. Sorry, Gail, yes.
Well, I just wanted to say that according to Mark, it's the chief priest who riles up the crowd.
Right.
And gets them behind Barabbas.
Yes, there you go.
We're told the motive is jealousy.
Yes. Or Pilate, the text tells us Pilate knows
That it's
Pilate is aware that they handed him over out of jealousy, and therefore it's a conspiracy, and
Right.
there's no foundation to it.
Yep.
So what do you deduce from that little element of the narrative, Gail?
Well, that the crowd is manipulated fairly easily, I would say.
Right. Yes, it's manipulated easily in favor of what?
In favor of well, they know somebody's going to be saved. And
In the way the story is structured, yes. Go ahead.
yes, and so Barabbas, the choice of Barabbas, it's as though we're supposed to know that Barabbas deserves crucifixion if anybody does.
Well, he's a murderer. He is a murderer. It says explicitly the guy's a murderer.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a weird rivalry there.
Well, there is. So this bringing Barabbas into it now with Pilate and the crowd and the high priests, and then this figure of Barabbas, whose name is very weird, and we're going to get to that in a minute. The small element, this relatively small passage of text becomes very dense. It's full of stuff. There's a lot going on here. It is, and it's literally life or death. So we're looking at on the one level, if we approach it theologically and say, well, if this is all being, so this is part of my argument from the beginning, that if you look at it theologically, and what the most preachers would have ended up with, but this has to happen in order that our sins are forgiven and we don't go to hell. That's where it all would end up. So there's a kind of mechanical nature to it, but at the same time, the density and the thickness of the drama is palpable. It can be tasted in the story, and we're right there with the crowd and with Pilate and with this weird figure of Barabbas. So the dynamic I'm saying is that if you settle it all at the level of theology, then the intensity of narrative has to go somewhere in the listeners. The passion narrative is going to produce some result in the mass of Christian listeners, and I think it's a very dangerous text for that reason, but entirely transformative if you get into it. But yeah, Dan, go ahead.
Me?
Mhm.
Oh, I didn't.
No, I thought you put your hand up.
I did at one point. So
Okay.
I
But
almost forgot.
Claire also had something to say as well. So
Okay, right. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was struck by the fact that by Pilate identifying Jesus with a term that would have triggered the high priests, to call Jesus their rival in some theological sense, by giving Jesus this honorific title, King of the Jews, that would have triggered those that regarded themselves as the spokesman for the Jewish people, and they would have stirred up the crowd because this is so from my point of view, this is a manipulation of, as Gail says, the power structures to stir up the crowd, because they're going to play on that. It's a dramatic sort of mocking of the very title that.
Well, I'm sure that is true. I'm sure that on the one hand, it's very plausible that in order to get him crucified, they said he's a messianic pretender, and Pilate said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "Well, that he's claiming to be king." I mean, that's the way Messiah gets translated into Romanese, into Latin, into the Latin Roman world. That's what a Messiah is. He's a pretender to be king, but definitely he would have used it as mockery as well, especially when he puts up the notice above Jesus on the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It definitely is mockery. So there's all these things playing, that all these emotions casting back and forth. But what I'm saying is that the listener, without the education and the revelation of the gospel about violence, is going to look for someone to blame. And Pilate is let off the hook. The chief priests, they're obviously the agents, as Gail says, but the ones who turn the tide are the crowd, are this undifferentiated mass, faceless mass, as Reuben tells us, and it's only one tiny step away from that to saying, who are these people? Well, they're the Jews. It's incredible. If you do not see it in the terms so my argument is, if you don't see it in terms of the dynamics of violence, you're going to see this in terms of who's good and who's bad, who's right and who's wrong, who could be blamed and who could be further assaulted, hurt, wounded because of this. So in other words, in this study, I am trying to hold up to account the historical Christian, Western Christian account of the meaning of the crucifixion, of the passion and the cross and the death of Jesus, as a payment in some ways to God. and saying how intensely dangerous and destructive that was and has been throughout the ages, and how we are now at a tipping point, because people generally don't believe that anymore anyway. Or unless you're a fundamentalist, you might believe it. The mass of culture wouldn't believe that. But now we're seeing that actually the truth of it is the revelation of the mechanics and the generativity of violence. It's impacted in there almost like the discovery of the atom. It's almost like the discovery of quantum physics when you see what the energy at the level of basic particles is. This is a discovery of the energy that's at the level of the crowd mobilized by whatever forces and mobilized in terms of violence, in terms of there has to be an outcome of someone who's going to get it.
And the fact that Pilate gets swayed by the crowds very easy and ends up, throwing his weight behind the crowd, and it just shows that someone even in that position of power can't stand against the crowd.
Now, what I'm saying, this is a very different reading of the scripture. I mean, of course, it's been background reading for us all the way along in all our studies, but we're kind of at this point in the scripture itself, in the gospel, where we're just looking at it and we're tasting it, and it's becoming a kind of like a kind of taste, something visceral inside our bodies about the way people work, and then suddenly you're presented with something very, very different. If this is the intention of God to reveal this to us, if that's what's going on, rather than this overarching need for punishment and satisfaction, that's all a completely false thesis invented in the 11th century, from which we've had a whole history of wrong as resulting. But instead, there's this other thing going on. Oh my God, if that's what God is doing, God is showing us this. That's what God is actually trying to do through Christ. Oh my goodness, that's very, very different. That makes the gospel very, very different.
We had the same thing, same dynamic with Peter and the servant girl, the weakest, but in the context of the crowd. So you've got even the weakest can turn the tide.
Right. So you get this thematic of the crowd, you see? I mean, how could that be avoided?
Yeah, and so you got the sort of weak servant girl, and then you got Pilate on the other end, but they're both swept up in the crowd.
I guess that's right.
You know what I mean?
Pilate, the most powerful person in Jerusalem at that moment.
Right, and servant girl's probably the weakest.
The weakest, yeah.
And yet
that's
they're
very
both
interesting.
They can't, neither of them, the crowd is what drives the violence in both situations.
That's right. And the energy of the crowd is what drives the whole situation. And we even have the soldiers. Sorry, go ahead, Claire, sorry.
Ask one question, but to follow on from, one of them was about following on from Dan, to think that Pilate actually was also stirring on the high priest in a very sort of subtle way, like.
Yes, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
So he's sort of instigating, manipulating them as well, I think. But the thing that interested me was, and Pilate was amazed when Jesus didn't say anything, and I was wondering whether that meant something to do with, there must have been an energy from Jesus. So it couldn't have just been him not talking, because you could be terrified or something. There must have been some energy there that made, I'm just wondering why they said, why was Pilate amazed at the fact that Jesus didn't say anything?
I think that's a wonderful observation, Claire. And I got to answer that directly, but answer at the same time as noting something else that goes in parallel to that, is that there is a whole succession of handing overs or handings over. So first of all, Judas is going to betray Jesus, we hear in the narrative, but the verb in Greek is hand over. There's not a word betray. It's the same verb as hand over. Judas is going to hand Jesus over. Then the high priests hand Jesus over to Pilate, and then Pilate hands over Jesus to the soldiers. So there's this whole string of handings over. And at the same time, we know that Peter did more or less the same thing, except that word is not used because it becomes technical in respect of what's happening to Jesus. It says that Peter denies Jesus, but effectively he does the same thing. As Linda says, in respect of the servant girl, he gives Jesus up. He says, no, there's nothing to do with me. So Jesus is being handed over, and the verb in Greek is paradidomai, which means to give over. Literally means to give, to surrender, to hand over. So that verb is very, very important. Now, if we go, and remembering what you just said there, Claire, if we go to Isaiah chapter 53, we see the exact textual basis for all this in the suffering servant. So we go to Isaiah chapter 53. If you go there, if you have that. So if someone would read, first of all, if someone has it, chapter 53, verse 7, and then go to verse 12. Just read verses 7 and 12.
I have it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And then 12, therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
Thank you, Gail. So here we have a kind of blueprint of what's happening in this so what we've looked at is the dynamic of violence as expressed in the crowd, and we still haven't done Barabbas yet. We're going to look at him in a minute. So we have the dynamic as far as violence is concerned, but then we have Jesus, because that's the question that Claire asked. What's going on with Jesus at this point? Why is he saying nothing? And why, and presumably, I think you're right, this is having an impact on Pilate, because he's amazed. Well, Jesus is fulfilling to the word the prophecy in verse 7. He did not open his mouth, like a lamb who is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So Jesus' practice at this point, he answers the high priest because the high priest asks him a theological question. He says, are you the Messiah? And then Jesus talks about the Son of Man. So Jesus is prepared to engage when it comes to the nature of the question of revelation in the scriptures and in his tradition. Well, but when he's before the secular authority who deals only in violence, Jesus does exactly what the servant is prophesied to do, which is to keep silent. And so in answer to your question, Claire, Jesus is, I would say, is self-consciously, deliberately, and spiritually keeping silent. So Pilate senses, Pilate with his gubernatorial skill, whatever it is, understands there's another dynamic here. He doesn't understand it, but he senses it. There's something else going on here, which is out of my realm. And that's what the Gospel of John really enters into with the whole discussion between Jesus and Pilate in John's Gospel, which we don't have here. So that brings us so it becomes this wonderful fidelity on Jesus's part to what is prophesied essentially in Isaiah about the servant, that he's got to do this. And then when we get to verse 12, the verb that he handed himself over, the verb that he poured himself out to death, which is what you read there, Gail. That verb in the Greek text of the Old Testament is paradidomai, is handed himself, hand over. It's not pour. The more recent translations prefer pour, but you can see the same movement, the same interior movement is at stake, where you're handing over yourself to the other. And that's why in the prophecy, therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. That he will overcome Pilate, should we say? So it's his handing over that does that. And what the Gospels narrate, and this is so wonderful, I think, is what the Gospels narrate is the succession of incidents of passively being handed over by through the force of others, through Judas, through the high priest's soldiers, through the high priests themselves, and then through Pilate to his soldiers, etc. So he's just being pushed on physically from one situation of powerlessness to a greater situation of powerlessness until finally they do flog him, and then they actually put him to death on the cross. Internally in Jesus, this is his pouring himself out, in the more Hebrew expression, to death, rather than imitate or retaliate or repeat in any way what's being done to him. So it's a breakthrough. It's a colossal anthropological breakthrough, which we've not seen, which we've misinterpreted in terms of overarching divine violence, but in actual fact, it's the breakthrough of God's nonviolence willed in the servant and fulfilled in Jesus. So what we're looking at, it's not this horrible kind of mechanical sequence which is driving Jesus to suffering and death, willed by God, but it's a revelatory drama of one moment after another, going all the way from the temple, really, when Jesus intervened in the temple, and then the verbal attacks on him, the controversies, and then his knowing that what this is going to lead to, and his physical kind of surrender to it in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then the succession of passive handings over, and that lead ultimately to his death. So we have a kind of like this incredible theater, which has been blocked to us for hundreds of years. Really, we've not seen it for what it is because of a false medieval interpretation of divine honor and violence, essentially. But what's good about that is that we're now entering into a moment of incredible freedom, where we're seeing the true meaning of the text and the person behind the text, which is Jesus. What do you think about that? This gospel this portion of the gospel that we've just read, as a narrative of the disclosure of violence by someone who's chosen by God, who wills and accepts that this is his job, his destiny to do this in order to bring this thing to the surface. What do you think about that?
I think it's good.
Uh, well, Heather, you said that? You said
Yeah,
that, Heather?
yeah.
Okay. Gerald, I'll come back to you. Heather, why is it good? Heather.
I think it makes it all very relevant for our times, as Ruben was talking about ICE. Because like if I think what you're saying is because we interpreted Jesus's murder and death as this payment, this transaction, then we were then able to stay in that transactional way of thinking, and we went ahead and scapegoated the Jews and continue, like Christians still are. I guess it's the same, like my relatives who believe in the second coming and in the temple in Israel and all that. The Jews are very important in that they're like a player in that whole thing of Jesus coming back. So they're not scapegoating them, but they're using the Jews in a way.
Yes, exploitation.
And they don't, and there's no real victims with the Palestinians, like there's no,
Right.
they can be scapegoated or whatever, like, so, and also with people that are supposed to be, people that are called illegals or whatever, you can stay in your transactionalism, stay in that whole way of thinking and understand what happened to Jesus in that way. Or you can say that they're all, you can see the mechanics of it and that we continue to perpetuate it. So the Holocaust was possible because we didn't see that, and we can create another Holocaust. We can keep creating more of these things if we don't see that. What was the important thing about what he was doing, what he was teaching us, what he was drawing us into.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for that, Cheryl.
So I've been thinking that this the echo from Isaiah, and not just an echo, a complete structure, the complete structure of Isaiah.
Yes.
But the silence, that he opens not his mouth. One of the things I think about is that he could have opened his mouth according to the belief of many and called down. He could have opened his mouth and called down angels from heaven to help in a violent repercussion.
He said he could do that.
Yes, he did. So he, when he refuses to open his mouth, it's a refusal to participate in this whole system. Just, the silence is not empty silence. The silence is full and a generative silence of what's going on there. But the other thing I was thinking about, if this story is our paradigm of how we are to face the scapegoating mechanism in our time, then how we tell the stories of people today has to be patterned after this story. Has to be. So that, and we cannot not tell the stories. They have to be told over and over again, not the Jesus story, but the story of the person down the street who is being taken away, the story of the journalist who is being killed, the story of the woman who is being raped, the story of whoever, that those stories have to be told with this paradigm in mind, so that it is not just one story, it is a million stories being told in this story. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about here. And so I guess I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Cheryl, because that is extremely powerful. because all those stories are readily told, the stories that you mentioned there,
Correct.
are readily told by those who are offended by them and and want to strike back in some ways, and they're going to find the perpetrator. They're going to find the one to blame, and there is someone to blame when someone is killed, obviously. But if you tell the stories with that paradigm, as you say, of the story that we're reading here, that shifts the meaning of those narratives. It doesn't mean to say you're not telling those stories. Like you say, you have to tell them, but it shifts where you're going with that, and that itself is a huge commitment. That is amazing that you could even think of doing that. But
Right.
that's the Christian. I think that's the Christian way of, that's the Christian vocation. If we even dare use that word anymore, that Christians have a vocation. Yeah.
So, and the where my brain was stumbling was that it is my inclination reading this story to turn away from it. It's so
Yes.
painful, and
Yes.
so it is to turn away. And my inclination in the stories that go on all around us is to turn away.
Right.
And so what this is saying is don't turn away. This silence is not empty.
Okay.
This is
Okay.
generative.
I
And
understand.
so
Yeah.
we have to tell the stories and not turn away from them.
Thank you,
So,
Sean. I understand that now. Thank you. Go ahead, Gail.
Well, maybe I'm taking this too far, but thinking of the turning over image and the pouring out image that is now being used, that brings to mind the Mark's telling of the Last Supper,
Yeah. Okay.
in which Jesus says he is pouring himself out.
Right. Yeah.
Translation. And that takes away the idea that he is passively going through all
right. Right.
silently going through all this, but he is showing us a pouring out
Right.
that is counter to any idea of a father demanding anything.
That's amazing. Yes. I mean, that's exactly true. I think that's why you have to string all these elements of the narrative together, beginning with the temple and then the Last Supper, like you're saying, because the Last Supper is a mime, as James Allison calls it. It's a theater. It's a kind of mimicry of what's going to happen, but it shows you that it's entirely intentional and it's the work of an agent, not a passive victim. So it becomes so powerful, and you can understand why in the early church they did continuously break bread, because there was something there about it which they didn't have. They didn't have the loaded up theology of atonement. They just had this visceral experience of somebody pouring themselves out. So they kept doing this because it enabled them to do the same thing, kind of basically as Cheryl is intimating. We have Dan and then Sheila.
If this is really if now we're seeing Jesus laying his cards down.
Yes. Yes.
This is really why he's come.
Yes.
To this. This is the coming of the Son of Man, and in a way, this is the epiphany.
Yes.
Of his intentions when he left Galilee. This is what it was about. I never kind of understood that because the events at the temple seemed to be about animals and sacrifice but I'm beginning to think that the temple represented for Jesus a kind of a distortion of God's way way of
Very much so.
of being with humanity
Right.
and it had completely distorted all of the relationships that God sort of wants humanity to emulate. So Jesus somehow felt it necessary to take that paradigm. He couldn't stay in Galilee where he could build the kingdom, gather people into communities of compassionate kind of love of enemies, and try. He somehow felt it was really necessary to expose and disclose the violence that's embedded in religion. Is that right? I mean, is
I think that's magnificent. I think because um, it really pictures Jesus as a kind of Galilean revolutionary, but not not in any kind of violent sense. That Galilee is despised in Jerusalem because it's not authentic Judaism. It's that nobody really knows where those Galilean Jews came from. They're not the descendants of the returnees who claim from Babylon, who claim the authenticity of their lineage. So they're always a bit suspect. I mean, the most suspect were the Samaritans, of course, but then the Galileans as well. So Jesus, this revolution of the Father and the suffering servant comes from Galilee. It doesn't come from Jerusalem. But like you're saying, Jesus decides, well, I have to go to Jerusalem to show them this, and also to basically overturn the way they've got it structured and that they've set it up as you say, as a religion. So he's carrying this in quotes revolution from Galilee because it goes. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I gather you together as a chicken, a hen gathers her chicks, but you refused it. And now your hour is coming. He sees it as a kind of judgment on Jerusalem, even as he is going to give it. So, I mean, he still claims authority over Jerusalem, even as he surrenders himself into its power. So what you've described is an incredibly dramatic progression from essentially the peace of Galilee and the Sermon on the Mount to this huge intervention that's going to get him killed and is going to turn the world upside down, because it's got right into the very core of the way we construct our human reality. Because everybody in Galilee did go to Jerusalem for the festivals, so it still had that power. Sheila.
Actually, no, I haven't. I didn't mean to put my hand up. I've just been waving my arms around them. I beg your pardon.
Well, you're waving your arms around in joy and pleasure, I'm sure. That's great.
No, it's just
So
a wonderful discussion. It's fantastic.
it is fantastic. I mean, it just strikes me. It's so vivid. I mean, like, go through this stuff and I go through Paul. We're going to go through Paul later on. Of course, he makes this huge proclamation out of it. It's highly valid. But you've got the actual blow by blow thing here, and you've got little details like Claire saying, well, what about what does his silence mean? And then you go back to the suffering servant, chapter 53 of Isaiah. And then we have this case of Barabbas. And it's wonderfully composed. Its irony and its mockery is so intense. It's like, well, the way that I described to myself. Has anybody here ever had a barium meal? They're pretty horrible things, barium meals. You have to. You've had one?
Yes.
You have to just swallow this disgusting stuff, which coats the lining of your gastric canal, and then because it's the way it's radio opaque or something, then it shows up well
Oh.
on the X-rays. Anyway, it discloses if you've got any kind of anomaly down there. What it does, it discloses it. So Jesus is a kind of barium meal. Except he kind of has to swallow it himself to begin with, and then we have to swallow it as well to kind of like understand it. We have to go there with him, and it's disgusting. It's horrible. And one of the really bad tasting bits of it is Barabbas. It's kind of like when you have to swallow the last. It's like anyway, anything disgusting you have to swallow for the sake of medical procedures. The last gulp is the most horrible, and you have to force it down. Anyway, Barabbas is kind of like that. He's the last bitter taste of this thing, because he suddenly appears from nowhere, and some of the commentators say, well, there's first of all, there's no authentication from historical sources outside of the Gospels that there was this custom that Mark invokes, that every year at the Passover, the crowd could demand the release of a prisoner. No one else records that. But we know that this is standard practice, that Josephus talks about it in other circumstances, and Livy and other people. Everybody knows about the power of the crowd to demand the release of a chosen prisoner. And of course, we have pardons granted by the president these days. And where does he get his power from to do that? Where does he get his impunity to pardon a criminal? It's from the
Constitution.
It's the Constitution, but where's the energy that stands behind it? What's the energy that says we're prepared to give this person here a complete buy, and they could really be a total criminal, and then blame somebody else? Where's the energy there, Sheila?
The people.
The people. We the people. We can do this. The president decides in our name because we have that power. It's scapegoating power par excellence. We can decide who gets to live and who gets to die, and who is the one who's going to carry the weight of the violence, and who's going to escape from it. How do kings come about in the first place? As Gerard tells us, a king is a sacrifice in waiting. Of course, if they're clever enough to manipulate it, they don't get sacrificed. They just sacrifice somebody else. Felipe, you want to say something? No, okay. Anyway, Barabbas appears out of nowhere in respect of this power of the crowd. Again, the crowd is at play. And some people say, well, Barabbas is a fiction invented basically to further increase the guilt of the crowd. It kind of circles back to blaming the Jews. The mentality of the commentator is that this has to be invented, and what's at work here is to increase the culpability of the crowd, i.e. Jews, because they let this guy go completely free, and he was a murderer. Well, if you want to see it that way, you're cycling back into the generative mechanics of violence. But if you say, and this is what some of the other, Raymond Brow, for example, says, that the Gospels, or Mark, beginning with Mark, highly unlikely would have invented a character with this name. because it's so close to Jesus. Bar Abbas means son of the Father. Or it can be read in some of the versions as Bar Rabban or something like son of the master. But I think that's trying to soften it on the part of the copyists. I think Bar Abbas is much more likely the original because it's so scandalous to a Christian reader. You have somebody popping up right at that moment, at the most critical moment for Jesus, who mimics the name and identity of Jesus as far as Christians are concerned, and yet is an insurrectionary and a murderer. So the commentators say that is unlikely that a Christian writer would have invented that, because it's actually insulting to Jesus, to his own identity. It's a parody and a caricature if you see it that way. But in fact, I think more likely is that Barabbas was probably a nom de guerre of an insurrectionary. He called himself that, son of the Father, or that's a plausible explanation. You know, in order to gain notoriety and a kind of the interest of the crowd, he got himself a stage name, a popular name, and we can see how the way the crowd reacted to him. They did give him the buy. So Barabbas, his name worked for him. So I wouldn't be surprised if he himself invented that name or took it on himself as a revolutionary. Well, what we do know is that he's a revolutionary. So the gospel brings together the actual account that we're reading, brings together both the crowd and Pilate. Pilate's at the summit of imperial power. You have the crowd that mediates all power, and then underneath you have an insurrectionary who wants basically to replace Pilate. But to do so, he has to get the crowd on his side. So you have this perfect picture of political power at work. And it's all a parody, a false parody of who Jesus is and what he's doing. So Barabbas, who actually appears in all four Gospels, and I'd forgotten it, but I checked it, is there in John as well. So he's in two separate sources. If we take Mark and John as separate sources, he's there in all four Gospels, and he appears plausibly as an insurrectionary who is liked by the crowd because he's anti-Roman, and he followed it through by killing a Roman or a Roman official. And here we have this Jesus guy who appears, so this answers the question, or part of the question, who appears publicly before the crowd for the first time before the Praetorium of Pilate. Remember that he'd been tried by the chief priests in the privacy of Caiaphas's home, or Annas's home, and then afterwards by the whole Sanhedrin in some kind of meeting. But it was still a meeting of the select few. Now he's out in the open, and now is his chance to rally the people. This is his last moment. He could rally them. He could shout out against the Romans. He could invoke the power of God, as Cheryl is saying. He could have done something absolutely astonishing. He could have called down fire from heaven. He is silent. What is that going to do to the crowd when he says nothing? How are they going to feel? Claire, I can't hear you.
Oh, I wasn't actually putting up my hand, but I was just saying it would further add to their anger.
Yes.
Also, you know you can't hear me, but the sacrificial victim is accepted, it only works when the victim absorbs the violence, you know.
Yeah, well, we're talking about the crowd here who want the violence. So Linda's, we're having a discussion. Is Linda? So there's a little. We're both together in the same room here, and just why don't you come and sit over here beside me if you can? Anyway, so you-
Well, I was just saying that that in sacrificial terms, if an animal, a sacrificial animal is always like a dove or a lamb, it's one that doesn't fight back, and that's why it works, because if an animal fights
but we're
back,
not. But we're
I
not
know,
in
I
the.
know,
We're
I
not in
know,
the temple.
I know, I
This is
know,
not a sacrifice.
I know, but I'm saying that if you talk in terms of the of Gerard's theory of how a scapegoat works, the scapegoat has to absorb the violence of the crowd. And if he was yelling and berating them, the crowd, then
No, he could have berated Pilate.
well, he could have done whatever. I mean, if he was answering back, then that whole system of violence like wouldn't work for the crowd and for everyone. You know, it wouldn't work. So Jesus has to go through that whole mechanism in order to break it down.
To reveal it. But and I think that's right. But in the actual instance, he should have acted like an insurrectioner if he wanted to save himself. And as Linda says, he doesn't want to save himself because he wants to reveal that. So from that point of view, his silence is revelatory. But as far as the crowd is concerned, they feel cheated, they feel let down, they feel he's weak, he's pathetic, he's Sleepy Joe times a million. You know, he needs to shut up and go away. And then all the chief priests have to do is say, "What about Barabbas?" And they say, "Yay, Barabbas!" Because at least he had the guts to go and kill somebody. So you see, you've got that incredible drama right there, and Barabbas is essential. The closeness of the hero, the messianic hero, who is going to liberate us from Rome, and Jesus is kind of is diabolical in its closeness. But it's also true in as much as that Jesus will liberate us from Rome, but not in the way in which Barabbas wanted to. So it seems that in terms of the revelatory power of the gospel, Barabbas has an essential role there, essential role in the story. At that very final moment, he totally alternative nature of the messianic who is Jesus. And so it's inevitable that Barabbas was going to be set free by the crowd, and that Jesus is going to be called for death. Is going to be sentenced to death by the crowd, because the crowd is going to go with the violent option, where the violence can be discharged. But he's not going to discharge their violence on anybody but himself, and that's not what they want. So you could see that this is an incredible moment of dramatic revelation, that, or semiotic, it's just plain to our eyes, once you go through it. There's this vivid, and all you have to do is say, well, actually, that is the revelation of God. that drama of the one who was led like a lamb to the slaughter and says nothing in his defense. That's the nature of God. And then suddenly, and then you have the whole gospel. You have the message of the gospel. Unfortunately, we have kind of mediated that back to a God of power and violence and vengeance. What do you think about that?
Perhaps.
Well, you can take my chair. Oh, sit down there. Here, look up.
I was just saying that isn't that kind of what Barabbas is uh as the son of the father? Is Barabbas is the son of the god
Yes, he is.
that the
Yes,
humans
yes,
have
they
reinvented,
want.
you know.
That's right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
a murderer from the start, you know,
that's
like
that,
the
that's
father
Satan,
of
yeah.
lies. So
Yeah, that's true.
that's
So he's
so when Barabbas is called the son of the father,
what
that's
father are we
exact.
talking about?
I mean, it's like the church or Christians through the ages have reinvented Jesus as in violent terms as a violent
Right.
hero.
Yeah.
But anyway, you can have your seat back.
I'm sorry for these musical chairs, but anyway, what is what? So that's the passion there. That or we've got we've yet to do. I mean, like the whole thing continues when he hands him over to the soldiers. There's another handing over, and the soldiers strip him. Well, first of all, he's flogged, scourged, and then the soldiers mock him, and the whole cohort, which is up to about 300 men, they all turn out. Why would soldiers do that? Because they're no different from the crowd. They still have, even though their business is they're under military discipline, if they can discharge their violence in that way, they will do so. And in the story, they did. So again,
And
it's all
it's contagious.
sorry, it's contagious. Yeah, it's a deconstruction of all levels of violence just through that simple narrative, because Jesus opted to take that role, and he followed it through as Dan says, from the beginning to the end. Claire.
Just thinking, it is quite intriguing to me as to why is it that, when you present, like Jesus did, either that sense of non-violence, not totalitarian, or kindness or pacifism or something, that it evokes such violence as well in others who are already violent. And I sort of think, is it something to do with a shame, that there's an underlying feeling of shame about your own violence, which maybe you can't articulate? But it's always intriguing as to why is it like these soldiers pummeling into this person who's not retaliating at all.
Right. So, say a bit more of that last bit there.
No, I was just thinking of it. It seems to evoke more and more rage. Like even though the person's not retaliating,
right?
The rage.
Yes. Well, why would I mean, Pilate did the same. He handed him over to be flogged. They all did the same. And so there's something about Jesus which is highly provocative. And
any sort of presentation of pacifism or any presentation of something evokes,
because
in societies, because it's seen, as you've mentioned before. I mean, even if it evokes things like weakness, you think, but what is it about that? And that's why I wonder whether there's an underlying, deep within us, sense of shame about that violence.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it holds a mirror up to us, and we don't like it, So it redoubles the violence against us. But at the same time, as Sheila mentioned, there's a kind of contagiousness to it that we cannot help but be infected. The very fact that we're upset by it, that we're ashamed, means that it's infecting us in some ways, that this thing is going inside us. But it's a long and painful process to take that barium meal and have it work fully in its revelatory power inside us. But it seems to me that like we've done in Christianity, we've done this full circle. We've gone around the whole planet, really, trying to get as far away as we can from the nonviolence of Jesus, and now we're kind of forced back to it by events, by the condition of the world, by ice, as Ruben began with us, and by the non-satisfactory character of all the other explanations. Go ahead, Ruben.
Yes, there's also that episode with Jesus and I think it's the teachers of the law, where he accuses them or he names them as children of your father, who
Yeah,
the devil.
yeah,
And it's contrast with the atonement theory of the Father requiring Jesus's death.
right, right. Yeah,
The,
yeah.
so it's just a contrast there that's not, if anyone is trying to kill Jesus, it's not God the Father. It's
No,
some other entity or some
right.
other agent.
Yes, yes. And we can see plainly what that agency is. I mean, and as Cheryl says, this would be very, very painful to read and impossible to read, really, unless there was a sense that God was in this and was overturning it. And that's the nature of the resurrection. But the strange thing is that there's no direct account of the resurrection in Mark. So Mark just faces us all the time with the radicalism of Jesus' intervention into human, in what Dan was saying in the whole story, going to the roots of it and refusing us to give us what might be interpreted in the old way as just a kind of deus ex machina, a kind of return to the status quo. He's not allowing us to see that the revolution that God brings us, we're not allowed to see it in cheap, superficial, old terms. We have to see it through by joining in with it in this radical interpretation, by going through with it in ourselves. So you are to be congratulated heartily for going through the story, and we still haven't finished with it yet. It's just this miraculous, transformative story, which all the art in the world, I think, all those wonderful art that we've seen, both painted and graphic and musical, whatever, none of it adds up still to the energy of this story, to its true energy, which is power. Dan, you have raised your hand one time more.
There was this passage in Mark 13 describing the coming of the Son of Man.
Right.
But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from the sky, the powers in the heavens will be shaken, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the angels and the elect are all that. Do you relate that at all to the events that we're reading tonight, or is this um, so? I guess what I'm asking is that scene of great power and what we think of as the divine sort of authority expressed in some second coming,
Yeah.
typically, but which some Mark scholars seem to think has a reference, is really referring to this coming of the Son of Man. That Jesus is sort of revealing God's mission to humanity.
Yeah, I think so.
in these events, and in the death and in the resurrection, the triumph of the resurrection.
I think so. I mean, those passages. I mean, I think there's a learning curve in early Christianity, and there's very possibly a learning curve in Jesus himself. I mean, I think the consistency of his actions in the Passion itself showed that he'd entered very, very deeply into nonviolence, and to surrender without hatred or anger. Coming in great power with glory doesn't necessarily mean violence. Our kind of automatic interpretation of it is, and I think when we turn to Paul, I think the letters to the Thessalonians, the early letters to the Thessalonians, suggest some of that, the wrath to come. But Paul seems to turn away from that, and or at least become much more nuanced about it. And then in Matthew's Gospel, that passage is followed by, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heavens, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. It kind of glosses that by saying, actually, the way in which the Son of Man will come will be with a kind of conversion on the part of the heart, on the part of human beings. And so I think you're right that that the resurrection, the full depth of the meaning of the resurrection, it has to be entered into by the early community. They have to, and then also the last meal, the last supper, as Gail was describing, it's something you have to enter into progressively, because I mean, if you think about it, this is the way we're structured, and this new structure is rising up within us. Then there's going to be an overlay until this other thing fully takes its place, and that means the nature and the character of God as well, how we understand that. So I think there is a movement, definitely, and not all biblical expressions, New Testament expressions are kind of equal in terms of that end point that we're looking toward here, that complete transformation of the Lamb, the Lamb that was slain since the foundation of the world. So anyway, that's all fairly exhausting.
Mm.
And if you're not exhausted, I definitely am. Time for me to go to bed. So anyway, would someone like to pray for us and bless us in this wonderful revelation? This, because I think this is a revelation that there's the light shining through all this.
Mm.
Heather, are you volunteering to pray?
I'm sure I can play. I can pray.
Please do.
No, we just thank you, Lord, so much for this day, and we thank you for each person here and for your word. We thank you for this wonderful study tonight, and we just pray that you work this word in us, and in our lives and into the world. This nonviolence, this amazing pathway that you take, Jesus. We just want to walk with you, and with one another, and help one another, and live in your love. So I pray that you be with all of us throughout the week until we meet up again next week. We pray in your name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Love and peace to everyone. Thank you very much.
Good night, and thank you.
Thank you. Peace to
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.